Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My name is Duncan Brown, and I'm a trustee with the Baltimore Council on Foreign Affairs. I hope this webinar finds all of those tuned in safe and well. Before I introduce Dr. Mark Hugo Lopez tonight, a quick announcement regarding the logistics for tonight's webinar. We are using the Zoom webinar platform tonight, so everyone is automatically muted and will stay muted. Additionally, the only persons you should see on your screen will be myself or Dr. Lopez. Tonight's webinar will include remarks by Dr. Lopez, followed by a Q&A session. Audience questions will be handled through the Q&A function in Zoom. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A button down there on the kind of the middle to right of the bottom. What you can do is click on that, type in your question, and then just hit return, and that question will come to me. And now to tonight's speaker. Dr. Mark Hugo Lopez is the Director of Race and Ethnicity Research at the Pew Research Center, where he leads planning of the center's research agenda focused on chronicling the diverse, ever-changing racial and ethnic landscape of the United States. He is an expert on issues of racial and ethnic identity, Latino politics and culture, the U.S. Hispanic and Asian American populations, global and domestic immigration, and the U.S. demographic landscape. Dr. Lopez was most recently Pew's Research Center's Director of Global Migration and Demography and of Hispanic Research. Dr. Lopez is also the co-editor of Adjusting to a World in Motion, Trends in Global Migration and Migration Policy, and he's also the co-author of The Future of the First Amendment and has contributed chapters to several books about voting and young Latinos. Prior to joining Pew, Dr. Lopez served as a research assistant professor at the University of Maryland School of Public Policy, and as research director of the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement. Dr. Lopez received his doctorate in economics from Princeton University. He's an author of reports about the Hispanic electorate, Hispanic identity, and immigration. He frequently appears in national and international media in both Spanish and English. Tonight, I've asked Dr. Lopez to discuss current U.S. immigration statistics, the major causes of migration from one nation to another, the history of major immigration movements into the United States over various time periods. And when I think of that, I think about which groups came when, the rules in place at the time, et cetera. And then finally, to discuss America's views on immigration policy over the last few decades and how those views have changed over time. Now, a word of caution, Dr. Lopez is from the Pew Research Center. And please do note that the Pew Research Center is a nonpartisan, they call themselves a fact tank, that informs the public about issues, attitudes, and trends shaping the world. And they do conduct public opinion polling, demographic research, content analysis, and other data-driven social science research. They do not, I repeat, they do not take policy positions. So if you ask Dr. Lopez via me in the Q&A what his view of current American immigration policy is and what we should be doing at the southern border, he's not going to answer you. All right, I'm telling you that right now. So with that, with those caveats, please join me in giving a warm, albeit virtual welcome to Dr. Mark Hugo Lopez. And sir, over to you.
Thank you very much, Duncan. I really appreciate the wonderful introduction. As Duncan noted, the Pew Research Center is nonpartisan, non-advocacy. We are a fact tank. You can ask me questions about policy, but I will more than likely say our public opinion surveys show and won't necessarily offer any particular thoughts. I'm going to share my screen because I have a presentation prepared for today, and I look forward to our conversation and questions. And here we go. And I want to start by presenting the broad global picture around migration. So when we talk about migration around the world, what do we know about the world's migrant population? That is, people who live outside of their countries of birth. So the number of people who live outside of their countries of birth, is currently at about 281 million. I want to stress that this is an estimate from the United Nations, but as you can see, the number of people who live outside of their country of birth has been rising over the course of the last few decades. The world's population has been rising, so no surprise that there would be more migrants if there are more people in the world, but the number has reached 281 million as of 2020. Now, that number is a big number. That's almost the size of the population of the United States, if you think about that. And when you take a look at that number, though, that 281 million, who are those people? Most of those people made a decision to leave their country of birth and go to another country, oftentimes for economic opportunity. We have found in our work here in the United States that many particularly Latin American immigrants come to the US in order to pursue jobs, in order to pursue economic opportunity, or to even have a better life for their children. But opportunity is a big part of the story for many Latin American immigrants. But not everybody who lives outside their country of birth voluntarily chose to do so. Some have been displaced, some are refugees, some are seeking asylum to seek protection. And in total, the UN estimates that of that 281 million, about 34 million people are either refugees or asylum seekers. Now, I want to come back to those two concepts because those are important concepts to understand the definition and also to understand what those numbers mean for the United States and other countries as well. But getting back to the story about global migration, about 3.6% of the world's population were migrants in 2020, but that's up from 2.8% in 2000. So even though the world's population has grown over this period, the number of people who are migrants, international migrants, has grown even faster. And as a result, the greater share of the world's population are migrants today. Where do people who are migrants go? What are the top destinations? Well, over the last 50 years or so, the United States, Germany, Saudi Arabia, Russia, and the UK have generally been the top destinations for international migrants. Now, these on a yearly basis, these positions can relatively change. And really, this is the countries that have the most number of immigrants. So you should know that the United States has by far more immigrants than any other country in the world. And I'm going to come back to those numbers in just a little bit. But know that the United States alone accounts for about 20% of the world's migrants. So when we talk about international migration, the US is the biggest single destination and biggest player in the space. What are the top origin countries of people who leave their countries of birth? Well, as of today, there are more people who've left India and are living outside of India than any other country, followed by Mexico, Russia, China, and Syria. Interestingly, Russia and the number of Russian migrants is a little bit of an interesting quirk because when the Soviet Union collapsed and many new countries were formed, there were people who were born in Russia who lived in, say, a country like, say, Belarus, and are counted as quote unquote international migrants, even though they may not have necessarily made an international migrant decision to leave. So keep in mind that that Russian number includes some interesting combinations of folks who are technically living outside of their country of birth. What's also interesting is that there's been a real shift in where people are coming from. New migrant waves have emerged in the last 10 years from places like the Middle East, North Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa. But you'll notice that one place that's not on this list is Latin America. So even with the recent surge of migrants coming to the US-Mexico border, Latin America is still, in the most recent data available from the UN, not one of the biggest sources of new migrants. In the past, it had been, but it's not necessarily the case anymore. Now, COVID-19 had a real impact on the world. As you know, there's many health and economic impacts, but another important impact was the closing of borders. This was a situation that was changing rapidly, and I'm showing you a map here that we put together at the end of March of 2020 that showed what countries had closed their borders either completely or partially. Oftentimes, this was not only about people traveling, business travelers or vacationers, but it was also closing borders to migrants. And the US border was essentially closed for the most part to international migrants during the course of 2020. I'll show you some evidence of that in just a little bit. But migrants were impacted by this. So the world's migration flows essentially came to a halt during 2020. But before we hit COVID, we were already seeing some big changes underway. And I'd mentioned some of this already. Regionally, in the 1990s, the single largest source of new immigrants were from Latin America and the Caribbean, many going to the United States, many from Mexico, in fact. But you can see that in the 2000s, that the things started to shift. Other places started to rise, like the Middle East and the Asia Pacific region, as sources of migrants, and particularly Sub-Saharan Africa. And in the last decade, we've seen that the biggest sources of new migrants have been places like the Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa. And notice that Latin America is actually the smallest contributor of new migrants to the world migrant population in the last 10 years, despite outmigration from places like Cuba and Venezuela and Central America. Those numbers, while impressive, remain far below what we saw coming in terms of international migration from Latin America in the 1990s, with the US being the biggest single destination. So know that these numbers and these destinations and these origins are all changing. This is a space where there's an awful lot of change occurring. And I think it's important to keep that in mind. Let's switch now to the United States, because I think the story for the US is really an interesting one. And I want to start with an important number. The United States, back in 1965, enacted something called the Immigration and Nationality Act, which changed the way the United States admitted people from other countries. Before, there were country quotas. There were also some quotas that were set very, very low for some parts of the world. It was really a European-focused quota system. But subsequently, with the change in the the Immigration and Nationality Act, the passage and signing of the Immigration and Nationality Act in 1965, the way in which the US admitted migrants changed. And in fact, the system we have today is very much built out of that 1965 law. Since 1965, the Pew Research Center estimates that 59 million people have come to the United States from all over the world. And I think that's an important number to keep in mind. 59 million people have come to the US. Now, not that many immigrants live in the US today. In fact, when we talk about the US immigrant population today, it stands at about 45 million. We have more immigrants than we've ever had before. You could see, compared to the past, say back in the 1850s or in the early 1900s, how many more immigrants we have today. The other interesting thing here, I think, to note is that the US is likely to continue to be an important destination for international migrants. And for our projections at the Pew Research Center, we project that by 2065, 100 years after that landmark legislation, we'll have almost 80 million immigrants living in the US, a country which will be about, at the time we project, about 440 million people. So growth in the number of immigrants who live in the United States, and again, this number is below 59 million because some people come to the US and then return to their home countries. Some people come to the US and live their lives and pass away in the United States. But 45 million immigrants is the number of immigrants that live in the US today. The second largest immigrant population in any country is in Germany, and that's about maybe 14 million people. So when you look at the US, 45 million compared to 14 million in Germany gives you some sense of how big our immigrant population is on a national or country by country level. You should know, as a side note, for those of you who are scholars of the European Union, as a group, the European Union has more immigrants than the United States does, but the US as a nation has more immigrants than any other country in the world. Of course, numbers with a growing population are helpful, but we oftentimes want to know about shares or percentages. And in this case, when you look at the story of the share of the US population that is foreign-born, that were born in another country, you can see that we're actually approaching the record high that we saw back in 1890. Then about 15% of the US population was born in another country. Today, we're at about 14%. But we are seeing a steady and pronounced rise in the share of foreign-born among Americans, after reaching a low of about almost 5% in 1970. So through the course of the 20th century, from the 1920s on, the US saw its foreign-born population decline. Part of the reason for that is the Great Depression. Part of the reason for that is US immigration policy, which set quotas on the countries people could be from. And there had been some attempts to really shut the door on immigration from places like Asia, particularly. Also, situations in other countries can determine who decides to leave those countries. And so the US, over the course of the 20th century, up until about 1965, was really seeing fewer new immigrants arrive, and its immigrant population largely aging and passing away in the United States. Speaking of immigration waves, what is the history of immigration to the US? Well, there are three main immigration waves that represent the arrival of immigrants to the United States over the course of the last 150 plus years. The first is, of course, the major European wave that happened in 1840 to 1890. That brought about 14.3 million people, mostly from Germany, mostly from North and Western Europe, also Irish. And it's notable that they made up the significant chunk of the population of people who were arriving in the country back in the 1840s to the 1880s. From 1890 to 1920 or so, the origins of immigrants who were arriving in the country shifted again. And in this case, it shifted towards South and Eastern Europe. So you see more Polish immigrants arriving, Italians, Greeks, you see Spaniards coming as well. It's a different wave than what you saw from the first wave, which is largely German and Irish in the mid 19th century. Fast forward to 1965, and there's that estimate of 58.5 million or 59 million immigrants in this wave and counting. But this is a very different wave. It's a wave that is largely Latin American and South and East Asian. Latin Americans alone account for half of this new wave of immigrants that have arrived since 1965. And to give you a sense of these countries that people are coming from, Mexico is by far the single largest source country for today's immigrants living in the US. They represent about 11.2 million people and make up about a quarter of all US immigrants. That 11.2 million, you should know, if you take a look at that number, that is almost as large as the total number of immigrants that Germany has. So Germany has about 14 million immigrants. The US alone has 11.2 million immigrants from just one country, and that country is Mexico. Immigrants from China are the next largest group at about 3 million. From India, about 2.6 million. The Philippines, 2 million. And El Salvador, 1.4. If I were to go down to the next 5 groupings, you would see Korea would be there. Vietnam would be there. You would see the Dominican Republic would be there. In other words, it's largely Asian and Latin American countries that are the primary sources of immigrants today for the nation's immigrant population. One other big story, though, to keep in mind is that when it comes to the sources of new arrivals, so in any given year, new immigrants come to the United States. Did you know that we now actually are getting more people from Asia than from Latin America, so that we now have more Asian than Latin American immigrants arriving in the US in any given year? And this has really been the case since the Great Recession. One other interesting thing to note here is that it is China and India that send more new immigrant arrivals to the US than Mexico in recent years, and that's been the case for about a decade now. Mexico is not the principal source of new arrivals anymore. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, that there's a shift in who's coming to the US, with Latin America slowing down and Asia slightly on the rise. Also, when it comes to the story of immigrants, how people come to the US can be in many different ways. You could be through family reunification. You could come to study here. You could come here as a high-tech worker. You could come here as a refugee or asylum seeker. There are so many different ways to come to the US as an immigrant. Did you know that the US has more college-educated immigrants than any other country in the world? Almost 15 million US immigrants ages 25 and older have a college degree. They make up about a third of all US immigrants. And I think that's an important thing to note, because the US has a lot of college educated immigrants, but as a share of the immigrant population, it is actually a much lower share than what you see, say, for Canada. In Canada, there may only be 4.4 million college educated immigrants, but they make up about 2/3 of Canada's total immigrant population. It only goes to show you that the US immigrant population is more diverse than some other countries, even though the US competes with other countries for the highly skilled around the world. I'm going to shift gears here a little bit and now shift into some key immigration trends and to share some administrative data on what we know about people who are in the US, sometimes legally, sometimes not, and what we're seeing in some of that data. First, the legal status of that 45 million people. Most are in the country legally. So about 3/4 of that 45 million are in the country with authorization, as I might say. About half of the 45 million are naturalized US citizens. These are people who have decided to become citizens of the United States. They've naturalized, gone through the naturalization process. About another quarter are lawful permanent residents. This would be people with the equivalent of a green card or so forth. And then there are temporary lawful residents as well, people who are here on temporary visas to work in the US, to study, etc. They make up about 5% of that total. About 1/4 or 23% are in the country without authorization. The Pew Research Center estimates that number to be about 10.5 million. Other estimates put the number anywhere from 10 to 11.5 million. So again, this is an estimate. We don't know exactly with the census count how many people are in the country without authorization, but we do know that it's somewhere around 10.5 million or so. So most immigrants are in the US legally. The trend in unauthorized immigration is one that's really interesting because the number peaked back in 2007, according to our estimates, and subsequently it's been slightly declining. You should know that most of this decline of from the 12.2 million to the 10.5 is of Mexicans who were in the country illegally and have returned back to Mexico. So most of that decline is in the number of Mexicans returning home. But there are some countries that we're seeing a growing number of people in the US without authorization from those countries. One is India. And in fact, the new, what you see today is that a large number of people who become unauthorized immigrants are becoming unauthorized immigrants because they overstay a visa. So visa overstays have become a very important source of new unauthorized immigrant population members. And I think that's an important thing to note. Yes, crossing the border is still a key part of this, but we have seen a growing share who are overstaying visas and hence become unauthorized because they're not, they haven't renewed their visa or they have to return home or so forth, but they're still in the United States. By the way, the country that's most likely to have the most overstayers is Canada, although most will only overstay by a day or two and then go home. But Canada and India are two of the big sources of overstayers. If you've been following the news, you probably have also been following what's happening at the US-Mexico border. And there are some very important trends emerging there that I think are worth talking about. This is a chart that shows you border apprehensions by the US Border Patrol at the US-Mexico southern border from 2013 on through 2021. So almost 10 years. It also shows you the combination of people, or the composition, I'm sorry, those people who are apprehended at the border. In the past, single adults, mostly men, made up the biggest chunk of people apprehended at the border. For a while there, particularly in 2019, it was largely families or unaccompanied minors, children, who were apprehended at the border, many of whom were presenting themselves to Border Patrol agents to apply for asylum in the United States. But this new increase that we're seeing since COVID started to wane is one that's being driven mostly by single adults. A lot of press focus has been on unaccompanied minors, on family units, but it's mostly single adults that are being apprehended at the border today. A little side note. This chart is apprehensions. It includes some people who may have been apprehended more than once. So the total here doesn't represent the total number of people apprehended. It's the total number of apprehensions. Sometimes people counted more than once because they get apprehended more than once. This also doesn't represent the total number of people crossing the US-Mexico border illegally. It is only those who are apprehended or who presented themselves to the Border Patrol. So keep that in mind, and that this is an estimate but not a good one of exactly how many people are crossing the border illegally. There is more, of course, to the US story about how people enter the country than just crossing the border. There is also all the different ways that people might enter. And this is a pie chart that shows you for fiscal 2019, about 1 million people were legally admitted to enter the United States that year in fiscal 2019. Most were admitted under family-sponsored visa programs. So these are people who were sponsored by a family member who's already in the U.S., who maybe even be a U.S. citizen, to join their family and come to the U.S. This could be sometimes a spouse, sometimes children, sometimes grandparents. We also have about 14% who were admitted through employment-based programs like the H-1B visa program or the agricultural programs. You have about 81,000 that were admitted as refugees through the UN's refugee program. And you have about 43,000, who were admitted through the diversity visa program, which, if you don't know about this program, it's a really interesting program that is a lottery that the US government runs for people who are living in countries that are not well represented in our immigrant population to apply and perhaps be chosen for a green card. And they can come to the US if they pass a security check. This is a program that that's been around for a while, and the country that usually has the most applicants is Ghana, by the way. And the US gets maybe around 20 million applications a year for this program. So if you think about it, that's pretty. That's a sign of how much demand there is to be a US citizen around the world in countries that are not well represented among our population. So Mexicans, for example, cannot participate, nor can people from China or people from India. Those are large immigrant populations in the US. But if you're from a country like Ghana or the Ukraine, you can apply to the diversity visa program for a chance to become a US citizen. Now, COVID had a big impact on the US immigration system. This is a chart that shows you on a quarterly basis how many people were legally admitted to the US as lawful permanent residents. You could see the sharp drop that happened when COVID hit the country in the third quarter of 2020. That would be around the spring of 2020. So immigration to the United States legally really dropped off. One other thing that happened is, in terms of refugee admissions and refugee ceilings, the US has really been lowering how many people it admits through the UN refugee program. And these are people who are identified by the United Nations as potential candidates to come to the US. You can see that the ceiling, which is set by the executive branch of the US government, so in this case, the president, had been at 110,000 people in the last year of Obama. But subsequently, President Trump lowered that ceiling to 18,000 by fiscal year 2020, and only about 12,000 or so people were admitted through that program. Now, you saw in an earlier chart that I said 80,000 people came into the refugee program. That represents people who passed the security check, were admitted in previous years, and so people don't come in exactly on the same year in which they're admitted. They got to go through a number of security checks. But you can see here that for refugee admissions, the US numbers have been declining. The US also used to be the world's leader in admitting people through the UN refugee program. In fact, the US used to admit more than every other country combined. But during the Trump years, the US was no longer the admitting the most. It was Canada. And the rest of the world now admits more people through the UN refugee program than the US has. President Biden has talked about raising the ceiling. So he's proposed to raise the ceiling to 62,000 through fiscal year 2022 and to 125,000 in the next fiscal year. This is partly because the programs that were in place to help refugees through this program resettle in the United States, they lost a lot of funding from the State Department and from the federal government. So many people were let go, and systems and processing centers or places to help people get resettled have basically had to shut down over the last few years. So that infrastructure needs to be rebuilt, and so that's why the Biden administration has proposed to ramp this up over the course of a couple of years to get back to where we were during the last years of the Obama administration. I want to finally talk about U.S. public opinion and immigration. Because of the Pew Research Center, we not only do demographic analysis like what you've been seeing, but also we do a lot of analysis looking at public opinion. And I want to share just a few findings that I hope are both timely and relevant, and also important to this you, this particular audience. First, Americans have changed their views about immigrants. Today, Americans are more likely to see immigrants as a strength than as a burden to the country, and it's a complete reversal from where we were in the 1990s. So Americans have generally become more the view that immigrants are a strength for the country. And this is again a reversal from where we used to be. This has happened for both Democrats particularly, but also Republicans. But you should note that Democrats are more likely than Republicans to say that immigrants strengthen the country. In fact, about 85% of Democrats will say immigrants strengthen the country through their hard work and talent, but only about half of Republicans will say the same. So there is a gap there, but even so, Americans generally are more of the view that immigrants are a strength for the nation. What about in terms of policy priorities? And you can see here that we've asked among the US public, what should be the policy priorities, particularly at the US border with Mexico? The most important one that people cited as a very important priority for the US government is to increase staff. So increasing staff or resources to patrol the border is seen as very important by 53% of US adults and somewhat important by 32%. So in total, more than 8 in 10 say that it's a very important or somewhat important goal or a goal for U.S. Immigration policy. You can see also increasing staffing and resources available to process unaccompanied minors more quickly. It's also seen as an important goal. 52% say that that's very important. But as you go down the list here, you'll see that the numbers start to decline the farther down you go. And at the very bottom, not allowing people to seek asylum in the U.S., 22% of Americans say that's a very important goal. 28% say it should be a somewhat important goal for the U.S. Clearly not zero, but about half of Americans say that not allowing people to seek asylum in the U.S. should be an important goal for the U.S. immigration system. What about in terms of how good of a job the U.S. government is doing handling what's happening at the U.S.-Mexico border? You can see that this is a question we've asked both in 2019 when there was an increase in the number of people apprehended at the border and more recently. And the share of Americans that say the US government is doing a good job has declined from 33% to 29%. The shift has been notable, particularly for Republicans, who generally back in 2019 when President Trump was president, 55% said that the US government was doing a good job dealing with the increased number of people seeking asylum at the US-Mexico border. Among Democrats then, only 15% said the same. But now that we have had a change in administration, views on this have totally shifted. And now Democrats, 42%, are more likely than Republicans at 13% to say that the US government is doing a good job at dealing with the increased number of people seeking asylum at the border. What about providing a path to citizenship for undocumented immigrants in the United States, or at least a path to staying in the US? You can see that generally speaking, the majority of Americans, 69%, say yes, that's something that is close, that's a view that's close to their views. But Republicans have been declining in the share that say those who are in the country without authorization should be allowed to stay legally, even if some requirements are met. Among Democrats, those numbers have stayed pretty much the same. 86% say that they support or believe that we should be providing some kind of a way for undocumented immigrants to stay in the country legally. Finally, where does immigration fit as a priority for the United States public? In early 2021, we asked about what should be the top priority for the president and Congress to address this year. And dealing with immigration was much farther down the list than, say, strengthening the economy, dealing with the coronavirus outbreak, et cetera. Only 39% of Americans identified it as a top priority. And when it comes to talking about long-range U.S. foreign policy goals, here's a series of policy goals that we asked about of the U.S. public. Should this be a top priority for foreign policy in the long run? And you can see here that protecting jobs of American workers, reducing the spread of infectious diseases, and taking measures to protect the U.S. from terrorist attacks were the top priorities that the public identified. Immigration was identified in a couple of places, but much farther down the list. Everything from reducing illegal immigration into the U.S. to aiding refugees fleeing violence from around the world to reducing legal immigration into the U.S. These are seen as somewhat lower priorities by the public for long-range U.S. foreign policy. I'm going to stop there. That was a lot to share. I've got much more. If you'd like to know more, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. But I look forward to our conversation and look forward to the questions that you have. I want to say thank you for the opportunity to present to you these findings from our work.
Thank you, Mark. That was terrific. I actually learn a lot every time I see this stuff. By the way, for everybody online, Pew Research actually has a tutorial on immigration. I think it's a 5-part series. You can sign up for it. You get an email. You get 5 emails over about 5 weeks, and it's got a lot of data, and it's really good stuff. And I actually looked at that stuff, and I liked it a lot. So,
Thank you.
anyways, if you go to their website, you can find it there. So the first question is, America has a long history of resistance to immigration, as well as being an advocate for immigrants. That is a dual view, and you presented that. Can you talk about what the potential root causes are for that resistance to immigration of specific groups?
Yeah, it's very interesting. So first, a couple of facts from our data. Among Latinos in the United States, Hispanics in the United States, about a third are immigrants themselves. If you look among adults, it's about half. But interestingly, in our public opinion polling, we find that among many Hispanic immigrants, about 10 to 15% will say, for example, that those who are in the country without authorization should be deported. So just because somebody is an immigrant doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be open to accepting other immigrants coming into the country, particularly if there's a sense that people are coming into the country by jumping a line or doing so by breaking the law. Now, there are many reasons why people hold the views that they do about immigrants, but part of the reason for even a nation, as we describe ourselves oftentimes, a nation of immigrants, might not necessarily be accepting of other immigrants, is it's partly about the way people might be coming to the country. And also, frankly, there is also partly about, in the past, there have been some very difficult views and challenging views, racist views about some groups like Chinese immigrants. And the US passed the Chinese Exclusion Act in the late 1800s that barred immigration from China. And so Chinese immigrants were the largest immigrant groups in states like California and Oregon and Washington in the 1870s, in the 1880s, into the 1890s. But with the Chinese Exclusion Act, China as a source of immigrants fell off of the list of top origin countries because people were barred from coming to the U.S. So it's quite a complicated story, but it's a combination of everything from immigrants in the sense of what's fair, assessing others coming into the country, to perhaps racist views, to perhaps policy that was directed at or reflecting the views of the public in many different dimensions, affecting who can and ways in which people can enter the country.
So the next question is, and that's really just to qualify what you mean by immigrants, and that is we're all immigrants, obviously, in one way or another. So how do you actually define immigrants? I'm assuming it's someone who's in the United States who was not born in the United States. Is that correct?
That's exactly right. Somebody who lives in a country other than that of their birth. So to be considered an immigrant, you're somebody who was born in another country. That's the international definition that is used by the UN. That is how the US Census Bureau reports this population. But many people also sometimes like to talk about other dimensions to the experience, the immigrant experience. So for example, your parents may be immigrants, but you may have been born in the United States. So you're the US born child of immigrant parents. Some might say that you're an immigrant too. Maybe depending on how they describe it, they'll say that you're a second generation immigrant. That's how I would describe that person. Some might say a first generation immigrant. Whatever the label is, it's somebody who's born in the US to immigrant parents. Somebody like myself might even be, some people might consider me an immigrant. I am US born to US born parents. It's my grandparents who were born in Mexico. But some people might say that you're an immigrant too. You're a third generation immigrant. But the official statistics of the United States, of the United Nations, of many countries count people who were born in another country but are residing, say, in the United States as immigrants. So that's an important thing to note. And I would also say that those who are born in Puerto Rico are not immigrants. Puerto Rico is part of the United States, but as you can see, one might talk about the migration story coming from the island to the US. It's not international migration, but they are migrants in a different way.
Okay. Just a reminder for attendees, if you do have a question, please put it into the Q&A tab. Has Pew seen a correlation between domestic racism and increased immigration? Have you guys looked at that?
We have looked at it some, but we haven't seen as sharp of a story as you might expect, and I think it's partly because of the inability of our surveys to necessarily get to the granular level. But one of the questions I've received a lot over the years has been a question about what happens when the share foreign-born in a location hits some sort of a threshold, like say 5% or 7%. It seems to be that when a community hits that level, that there may be an increase in anti-immigrant legislation. So some folks might cite, for example, communities in Alabama or Hazleton, Pennsylvania, various incidents that have happened over the years. But then at some point you get beyond that if the population of immigrants keeps growing and immigrants then become a part of the community in a different way. That's all speculation. We don't have any hard data that we have looked at to be able to draw those conclusions because, again, like I said, our surveys, while great at painting a national story, don't have the ability, the statistical power to really go and talk about, say, what do we know about public opinion in Hazleton, Pennsylvania? We're only doing national surveys and not local ones.
Okay. I noticed when you present your data, in some cases, you looked at Democrat versus Republican folks or leaning in a particular direction. As a proud member of the largest party in America, and that is the Independent Party, I think we're 40% and the other two are 30 each, roughly, and change. Do you also look at independent views?
Yeah, so that measure that I showed you should be very clear about how we define that. So we ask people, do you identify with the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, or neither, or some other party? So people who say something else are classified as independents. And like you said, the shares will be about what you just described. Then we ask those who say some other party to say, we then ask them, do you lean more towards the Democratic Party, or do you lean more towards the Republican Party, or neither? And people who lean more towards the Democratic Party, we then say, okay, well, when we do our analysis, we're gonna put together the Democrats and those who lean Democrat, same thing with Republican and lean Republican, so that the independent number is a much smaller share than what you shared earlier. So maybe about 15% of all U.S. adults, because many will indicate they lean one way or the other. It's just the way that we've decided to do our analyses. But you're absolutely right that the party identification can be very rich, and ours is only one way of approaching it.
So I want to talk about the replacement population rate. Obviously, to maintain where we are today, 330 million and change, I think, there's a replacement rate for that. In other words, to maintain that level. Without immigration, do we know where we would be? And with immigration, do we know where we are?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, for example, if there had been no immigration from 1965 to today, sort of this more recent wave, the U.S. population would be more on the order of about 260, 270 million people. So the population would be smaller. Also, it would be less diverse. It would be a population that has a higher share white and a higher share black, and Hispanic and Asian shares would be below 10% each. So that's an important thing to keep in mind, that immigration has really brought diversity to the country in addition to helping the population grow. We project that moving forward to 2065, with immigration, the nation will reach about 440 million people. And without immigration, the US population would peak in about the 2030s and 2040s at about 340 million and then start to sort of level off. That's a significant difference in terms of the potential numbers of people living in the United States with and without immigration. You should also know that since 1965, immigrants and their children have accounted for about 80% or so of U.S. population growth. That is pretty significant. And without immigrants in the last 10 years, the U.S. would have essentially not really grown.
What happens to the kids at the border?
So children from Central America who are presenting themselves to seek asylum, the U.S. government has been processing them. So what will happen is a group of children might cross the border and then wait till a border patrol agent appears. They will then present themselves to the Border Patrol agent, and the Border Patrol agent then will take them to a processing center. Depending on what part of the border they cross, they might be placed into a center with different levels of resources, again, depending on where they are. The U.S. has been trying to find ways to have those children placed with somebody within the United States so that they can be placed with a family member. That could be an uncle, that could be a mother or a father, many different ways that might happen. But the U.S. government is facing a large number of people who are presenting themselves, children who are presenting themselves. And if you've been following the news, processing times have become very long, and there have been some questions about the amount of resources that are being dedicated to both house the children at the border and families, and helping to link them to people around the country. But this is something that the U.S. government has done for a while. That is that if you present yourself at the border, you're seeking asylum, there will be an attempt to try to match you to a family who's somewhere in the U.S. And we've seen many come to the D.C. area because of the presence of the Salvadoran, Guatemalan, and Honduran communities here.
You mentioned Hazleton, PA. Is that a place where a lot of immigrants go to?
Hazleton, Pennsylvania, about 15 years ago, was a place where there was a growing immigrant population, largely Mexican. That the local community started to pass legislation to, for example, say things like you can't park your cars on a lawn, you can't have more than so many people in a house per bathroom or per room. There was a real attempt to try to make it harder for immigrants who were oftentimes families would double up in a home, and there might be many cars parked on the front lawn. In Hazleton, Pennsylvania, there was an effort to try to legislate that and make it more difficult. So it is a very, it was an important story for how a community was addressing the rise in the number of immigrants living there.
There's a lot of talk every now and then about immigrants taking jobs that would otherwise be filled by Native Americans. Is that true? Is it not true? What do your numbers say?
There's no doubt that there are, in some cases, immigrants do take jobs that perhaps could have gone to somebody who was born in the United States. First, on public opinion, most Americans say that immigrants to the U.S. are not doing that. In terms of our data, the U.S. economy has grown rapidly over the last 20 years, and the labor market has also grown, so there's more jobs available. So it's kind of hard to say immigrants are necessarily taking a job one for one from somebody who was born in the United States. But generally speaking, immigrants, particularly from Latin America, tend to be in jobs that are in the farm sector or agriculture sector, or in meat packing or food processing, or in the hospitality industry. They don't dominate those industries. They're not the majority of workers in them, but they're a significant share. But most workers in most of those industries are US born. So it's really kind of a nuanced story when it comes to the impact of immigrants on the job market in the US. Right now, it's notable that the US has, it seems to have a shortage of workers, or at least people aren't going back to work quite as quickly as many analysts had expected. The U.S. unemployment rate has been coming down, and it's very possible that perhaps the U.S. might need more workers, and maybe those workers might come from other countries. It remains to be seen, though, of course. It depends on how COVID plays out.
Okay. Switching gears a little bit, can you talk about NAFTA and or the new act that replaced it, and whether that's had an impact on immigration from Mexico?
So Mexico's immigration story has been one of decline over the last almost 15 years now. It started in 2006. The Mexican immigrant population in the U.S. peaked then at about almost 12 million people, and has been slowly declining ever since. There's a number of reasons for that. One of which is Mexico has been doing better economically, and so there's more opportunities in Mexico today than there were, say, 20 years ago, so people have an incentive to stay. A second part of the story is that many of the people who were going to come to Mexico probably did. Come to the U.S., probably did. And so is there still a large pool of potential migrants in Mexico to come to the U.S.? Seems like maybe Mexico's declining birth rate may have limited that pool. Now, NAFTA and its and its successor. I can't remember the exact name of the, I can't remember the acronym, but they do oftentimes have in place some kind of immigration pathways for people from Canada and Mexico and the US to migrate back and forth between different countries. And so that does have some impact on Mexican migration. But I think that it's a very rich story that has so many components to it. And a big component is what's happening in Mexico, since that's a big driver of why people decide to come here. As a side note, if Mexico were to have some sort of a problem politically, or if you were to see the cartels, perhaps things become less safe in the north, particularly because of the drug cartels, we might see more migration from Mexico. I don't know. It could be that we could see a different kind of migration as well, maybe high skilled in some way more than we've seen. But I will say that one thing that's changed in the last 10 years is that there are fewer Mexicans coming who have less than a high school diploma and a growing number who have a college degree. So we're getting more engineers, we're getting more scientists, and we're getting more educated professionals from Mexico than we used to.
All right. Trying to think of the next one to hit here. How do you guys build credibility?
At the Pew Research.
Yeah, Pew Research. I mean, obviously people may come back and say, well, that data's not quite right, and you didn't do this, and you didn't do that, and you skewed the data because you only looked at this part of it, and there are other things going on. And how do you square that?
The biggest thing that we do is we're transparent. So transparency is a huge part of how we present our research. So all of our data is publicly available. After we publish a report from a survey, that data from that survey will be available for anybody to look at. We're also very transparent about how we collected our public opinion data. We're transparent about how we define concepts in demographic data, say from the US Census Bureau. And so you'll find that oftentimes we might publish a report that has, maybe 3-5 pages of report and like 20 pages of method. And that's on purpose in order to be as transparent as possible. We also, by not taking positions on policy, by not talking about policy, by not saying this is what the government should do or this is what Congress should do, that also helps to build our reputation, because our job is not to advocate for anything. Our job is just to present information. And we're always working very hard to ask questions that are straight, that don't have a lot of preamble or a lot of nuance in them that might confuse respondents. You want to be very careful about how you craft those questions. But that's partly how we built our reputation, is through transparency of our methods and also by not taking any positions on policy.
Okay.
Oh, we also don't take any, the money that funds us is largely from the Pew Charitable Trusts. So we don't take money from government organizations. We don't take money if there are strings attached for a research project. We're not available for hire when it comes to, say, somebody wants to hire my team to do an analysis of how much of a positive impact immigrants have had on the U.S. We would never take something like that.
Okay. So why is it so hard for politicians to differentiate between legal and illegal immigrants? Is it that they just don't understand the facts and the definitions, or do they choose not to, or what's going on?
I'd say that this is something that you see happening with a lot of the public. The public is not aware generally of how our U.S. immigration system works. Earlier, I was talking about all the different ways people can come to the U.S., and there are many different pathways to legally come to the U.S., and it is complicated, very complicated. As an expert on this, I find that sometimes it can be very hard to keep track of everything that's happening and changing in our U.S. immigration system. So the general public doesn't do that as well. I mean, I can't imagine that my mom is sitting there thinking to herself, oh, Justin Bieber came in on the O visa, and, I really wonder what that is. Oh, that's an entertainment visa. So these things are just not on the general conversation of the public. Also, many Americans are themselves not immigrants. And so, many Americans also don't have a passport. They're not crossing borders like, say, you see in Europe, where immigration and migration issues are front and center for the general public, because people got to have their identity cards and so forth. Now, what about politicians? Well, I think that these are very complicated pieces, and the focus on unauthorized or undocumented or illegal immigration is something that many people and many politicians focus on because it's so front and center. And you see it in the news. It's people crossing the border without authorization or crossing the ocean illegally in the case of Europe. All these are things that are in the forefront of the public's mind, and you don't hear as much about people who might come here legally and through family reunification. That's not a story that you hear much of. I will also say that in our surveys, people, whenever we ask a question about immigration, will usually at the end of the survey say, "You meant illegal immigrants, right?" Even though the question was a very general one about the impact of immigrants, it's on the minds of the public. It's on the minds of politicians.
Do you have, one of the things I didn't see in the data, and I'm sure it's there, is what percentage of the roughly 50 million immigrants in the United States are male versus female?
It's mostly male, so it's more male than it is female. I want to say it's 55-45.
Okay.
So it's not overly so, but many people who come to the U.S. are men, particularly those single adults being apprehended at the U.S.-Mexico border these days are largely single men, oftentimes young too, like between 16 and 25. Family reunification and also different visa programs do sometimes attract more women, but it depends on a number of different reasons. But generally speaking, it's more male than female, more so than the general U.S. public.
I want to go back to the children for a minute. So a child gets dropped at the border. They have absolutely no contact in the United States. There's no one who claims them. They may not even know where they came from. What happens to them? I'm assuming they get taken care of and they get put up for adoption or something. Is that correct?
Yeah, there's so many more details to this, but it does. If they don't know what country the young person is from, the person will eventually be assigned a court date, and there will be a date where their case will be processed in the United States to whether or not they can get asylum or not, and then they might be placed with a foster family. But it depends a lot on the situation of the individual. More than likely, though, it'll be known what country the person is from, and if the person is from Mexico, more than likely they will be returned within 24 hours because there's an agreement between the U.S. and Mexico to return children, particularly that quickly. For Central America, though, in other countries, that's not the case, which is why you will find that there will be a court date set. The young person might be placed with a family member or somebody who they know or a foster family, and then are required to come back a year or so later for that court hearing about their asylum case. And so it's quite complicated.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there's always been this talk that if we just spent more money and made more investments in Latin America and tried to fix the reasons why folks come here in the first place, do we have any data on that and how well those investments are working or not working? Or
Yeah, it's a really great question. We don't have data from the Pew Research Center that looks at this question, but others have done work on this to see what are some of the reasons that migrants are coming to the U.S. today from, say, El Salvador. And part of it is about concerns about safety. Part of it is about economic uncertainty. So people are coming to the U.S. in order to find a job. Part of it is about fear about their children perhaps being recruited to be part of gangs in, say, Honduras, or there is perhaps some sort of a climate disaster or a natural disaster that has led people to, because of a hurricane, their livelihoods have been lost, and so now they're seeking to go north because they know somebody in the United States. So there's a number of different reasons why that happens. As you can see, some of those things are things that perhaps could be directly affected by investments from the United States or other countries. Some of it may be a little bit harder to address, but we haven't done any research that looks directly at whether or not these policies and this money has been effective in either providing new opportunities for those who are living in those countries or stemming the flow. You should know that Europe has done a lot of similar things to the US in terms of providing funds to countries in Africa to stem the flow of migrants coming from sub-Saharan Africa. but oftentimes that has been around building a wall, building a fence, or military enforcement, just like at the U.S.-Mexico border about enforcement and security measures. That's what you see happening with many, in the case of Africa, many European countries paying for security to kind of stem the flow of people coming from the south.
So the next one is, how should we think about immigration that perhaps strengthens a country versus weakens a country? Should we even be thinking in those terms? Is there a way to think about that, or is that not a good way to think about things?
It's a really good question, and it's at the heart of a lot of debates about what immigration policy should be in the United States or other countries. Other countries have been competing against the U.S. in immigration policy that is focused on bringing in the highest skilled immigrants possible, so people with PhDs and so forth, to contribute to those countries' scientific or engineering or some other in some other way, both commercially and scientifically, for achievement. The United States has brought in immigrants in many different programs who are like those high-skilled immigrants with college degrees or PhDs and scientists in science or so forth. It's also have those programs to bring in agricultural workers to work in the field seasonally and to do so legally in order to harvest a crop depending on the season and the time of year. One question that I have, and your questioner here, I think, I'm wondering if they have if they've been thinking about this, is the world is aging, and as the world is aging, I wonder if the competition for migrants might shift to needing healthcare workers. And if you look at world demographics, the source that's most likely to be the biggest source of future migrants is Africa, because it's such a young population. So how countries compete for migrants could change in the future depending on circumstances, needs, and so forth. And it remains to be seen, I think, what policy will be in the future. But there's no doubt about it that many countries around the world have seen the success of the United States when it comes to immigration and are trying to recruit immigrants in more targeted ways. And some countries are also trying to win migrants that would have gone to the U.S. to go to their places instead to study and to get and to work and to build businesses and so forth. It's a competitive landscape.
So switching gears a little bit, we talked about immigrants coming into the U.S. What about folks leaving the U.S.? Do you have any data on that, and where are they going?
So a few years ago, we saw, for example, in the case of Mexican migration, that more Mexicans were leaving than coming to the U.S., so that the population of Mexican immigrants in the United States was starting to decline. For the most part, immigrants who come to the U.S. tend to stay in the U.S. You'll find 80% plus will make their lives here in the United States. But some come just to study. So they might be foreign students who are coming to study in the United States. They study for a few years and then they leave the U.S. And they pursue their lives back in their home countries. This is what's happening largely with China. You find many Chinese students come to the U.S. to study, get a degree here, and then return to China to work with U.S. businesses or Chinese businesses in mainland China. You also will find that people might retire after a certain amount of time here in the U.S. And I think it's also important to note that not everybody who comes to the U.S. even legally wants to become a U.S. citizen. So not everybody becomes a U.S. citizen. And in the case of Mexicans particularly, fewer than half who can get U.S. citizenship actually do. So many say that they'll return home to retire after working in the U.S. for many years.
Okay. So would you consider that kind of a rate of assimilation? In other words, folks come here and then they don't stay and they leave for whatever reason?
I don't know if assimilation is the right word. I've never quite know what to think about that word, because I'm not quite sure what it means.
Well, there was a question on assimilation, and I'm not sure what it means either. So that's why I kind of phrased it that way.
So some people might say that assimilation is that people come to a country and they eventually become part of the mainstream there. They get a job, they work, but they also culturally end up being like those who are the single largest group or the majority of the population. But that's a very amorphous kind of definition, I think. What I find that immigrants come to the U.S. for multiple purposes. Many are coming here for opportunity to work and to earn money, and many of them send money home. And so I think that it really is a story of it depends on the immigrant, and some may choose to maintain those ties with home and not necessarily adopt everything around culture and the ways in which we live and work here in the U.S. They don't necessarily adopt all of that, and that's okay because they're going to return home. But many immigrants do completely commit to life in the United States. They have their children here, they buy a home here, they create a business here, and they have a long run view of staying here. Even if they may not learn the language, may not learn English well, they are essentially doing the things that everybody else is doing by buying a home, establishing a business, and having a family here.
Switching gears, why are folks headed to Russia and Saudi Arabia? Those seem to be top destinations these days. I'm assuming it's for work.
So Russia, I would say Russia is not necessarily a destination today. If you remember early on, I said that when the former Soviet Union existed, many countries broke off and became independent countries and had populations of people born in Russia living in their borders. So that number of Russia being among the top destinations for immigrants, it's not necessarily the case today, but it has one of the largest foreign-born populations by definition. But it's just that the borders changed, and so it's not quite the same as, say, Mexicans coming to the United States, although some might say the borders shifted there too. In the case of Saudi Arabia, it is about oil. It is about construction. Many of those immigrants are coming from India. You do see this in the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, as well. That many people are coming there to work, and they're oftentimes from particularly Kerala in India.
Okay. I got a ton more questions. Geez, I've never gotten this many questions. You are like a star here. What percentage actually show up for their court dates or don't?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know the exact answer to the most recent data, but many don't. But I don't have a hard number I can point to. It's a good question, though.
Do you have numbers on what the public feels about when a child is born in the USA to foreign-born citizens, and yet they're considered a citizen? There's a name for that, and I can't remember what it is.
It's birthright citizenship.
Birthright citizenship. Thank you.
The U.S. and many countries in the Americas, by the way, are countries that recognize birthright citizenship. In Europe, many countries don't recognize it. They have bloodline citizenship. I forget what you call it. Can't remember the name. But in the U.S., if you're born in the U.S., you are a U.S. citizen at birth. We've asked about this in our surveys, whether or not people support the 14th Amendment and support birthright citizenship. And generally speaking, the U.S. public does. So more than 85% will say that they support birthright citizenship. But not everybody does. So it's not universal. I'm sorry. The other thing I think it's interesting, by the way, about birthright citizenship is one of the questions is, aren't immigrants in the country illegally coming here to have children, and their children then get all these benefits? In any given year, maybe about a few years ago, it was maybe about 300,000 births were to undocumented parents. So out of about maybe 4 million births in the country, so it's not insignificant, but it is a big enough and notable number.
By the way, to the attendees, I'm going to cut off the questions because we're already about 10 minutes over, and I still got a bunch to get through. And that's a testament to you, Mark, that there's a tremendous amount of interest and a lot of questions here. So there's something called I think it's the EB or E85 program, EB5 program in recent years, and that's where foreigners who invest in ventures that create jobs in the US can receive citizenship. Can you talk about how successful or unsuccessful that program has been?
Yeah, it's something that I haven't looked at in a long time. And I want to say that there's been a change in that program, that it's now either it's defunct or it's got a new name now. I don't know how successful it has been. I don't have it. It's not something that the center has looked at, so I don't have any particular data to look at, but I know it has been a source of controversy when it comes to talking about who the U.S. give citizenship to. In a sense, you're allowing people to. Some critics have said, you're allowing people to pay their way into U.S. citizenship. But unfortunately, I don't have anything new to point to, so I don't have anything I can share. It's a good question, though.
Any views on how important it is for immigrants to learn English?
The U.S. public generally says that those who are in the country and who were born in another country should learn English. They say that that's an important skill that people should learn. We find in our data that many immigrants desire to learn English, but also to maintain their native language, even among their children. But of course, many immigrants from Latin America, particularly, but also Asia, struggle to learn English. And 20 years on, they may not be proficient in English still. Notably, though, their children are. And we're seeing that in the case of Latinos in the US, the share of Latinos who are English speaking only is rising. And particularly that's true among children. So those under the age of, say, 18, about 40% of them speak only English, which, and generally speaking, maybe only about a quarter of all Latinos speak only English. So the future is one of where there's going to be more English-speaking people of Hispanic heritage in the country.
Okay. So the next one is, which author is required read on immigration in the United States and Europe? I would say the answer is Dr. Hugo Lopez.
Thank you.
Or go to the Pew Research site. There's a lot of information there, I can tell you, because I went there and researched a lot of stuff that you guys have. Unless you have somebody else that you'd like to recommend.
There are so many authors on this. I would highly recommend, if you're interested in the story, particularly of migration between the US and Mexico, the work of Andrew Seeley, S-E-L-E-E. He's the president of the Migration Policy Institute. He's written a book about the Mexican and US migration policy. I think he's one of the most important writers in this space. So I would encourage you to take a look at his work. And then if you're just interested in statistics, every year the United Nations and the its immigration arms publish important statistics about how many migrants there are in the world, including displaced people, people who are not only displaced across international borders, but also internally, refugees and so forth. There's some very important statistics coming out of those organizations, but I will say that the data is oftentimes estimates. And so we don't know with precision exactly how many people are displaced and so forth. We have good estimates, but these estimates are just that, estimates.
Okay. We're getting down to the wire here. We got 3 more to go.
Okay.
So current, and I emphasize the word current because I know this number has changed. What's the current expert opinion on the practical limit to human population on the planet Earth? I know it used to be a lot less than it is now because we invented things like short wheat.
You know, I don't know what that number is, but I do think it's interesting that we are starting to see some real changes in fertility around the world. Yep. And there have been some questions raised at the sometimes even at the Population Association of America's conference, which just happened recently, but even the estimates and projections for a country like India, which is projected to grow to 1.6, 1.7 billion people by the end of the century. But everything is pointing to a slowdown just about everywhere, particularly in countries like the United States, but also notably China, which is not a country that generally admits immigrants. So immigrants are not generally part of the story there. And also in countries particularly like Japan, Germany, Italy, France, you see fertility rates that are lower than the United States, and the US is below replacement now. So immigration is very important for maintaining the demographic dynamism of the United States. It's been so important over the decades, but COVID has really sort of slowed that down. I wonder how things will look in 5 years, where we will be in terms of migration flows. It remains to be seen.
Most quirky or interesting statistic that you've come across that just kind of blew you away and you said, geez, I never thought about that, or that doesn't, unbelievable.
Well, nothing is ever surprising. So, but I would say one of the things that I found in the process of learning about a lot of this over the years has really been the story of the diversity visa program for the United States. The US is the only country that does a program like this, with the exception, say, of New Zealand, but New Zealand does it for just the South Pacific. The US does it globally, but no other country has a lottery to diversify its immigrant population. It really does stand out in many ways compared to many other countries. So that was the one thing that I thought was most interesting about the statistics around immigration, is to see the diversity visa program, what it is, and even why it was created. It was created in the 1990s to offer a pathway for people from Ireland to come to the United States. And it was something that people of Irish heritage who were in Congress from the Northeast had pushed to have passed. And so it's, again, a sign of how varied, nuanced, and rich our immigration system is in terms of coming to the US, but it also, frankly, it's probably not as focused as other countries. And so I find many experts say the US system needs to be entirely overhauled, that it's not working. But I also wonder if it's not working, we do see a lot of people still coming to the country, and there seem to be so many ways to come. Does it have to be like Canada's system? Does it have to be like Australia? I don't know. But those are one of the observations for me that was something that I didn't know about that I found really interesting.
Sure, thank you very much. This was absolutely fabulous. You know, one of the ways I judge these things is by the number of questions we get, and you sir, by far are the winner in terms of all the webinars I've been doing for the last year. You got more questions than anybody else. I was having a hard time keeping up. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you to our attendees for tuning in tonight. Just a heads up, we've got two more that we're going to do this academic season, if you want to call it that. We've got two more coming up in June. Sean Roberts, he's a professor at George Washington University. He's going to talk about the roots of genocide in Xinjiang province, so the Uyghurs. And then I've got Steve Carmel coming. He's a senior vice president at Maersk Shipping, and he's going to talk about global supply chains and what's actually going on. So again, June 15th, June 24th, if you want to hold those dates, save those dates. And again, to Dr. Lopez, thank you, thank you, thank you, sir. I appreciate it.
Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for all the wonderful questions, everybody. And you can always reach out to us at Pew Research, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. I know, Duncan, I will send you that PowerPoint. If you'd like to share it with folks, they will have my contact information.
Yep. So to our attendees, if you want a copy of that PowerPoint, just shoot me an email and I'll get it out to you. And again, thank you, and everyone have a good night. And again, Dr. Lopez, thank you.
Thank you. Good night.